Let's suppose that in RKB for the travel agency, we have the airport transaction in the following state, and with these attributes. Also, in this transaction, we want to add the country ID and country name attributes of the country transaction, so that each airport has an associated country. Considering that the airport table already has records before the reorganization, what value will the country ID attribute have? Here we have two options, and it'll depend on how we configure these country ID attributes. If we set country ID to accept null values, when we reorganize and Genexus adds this attribute in the table, the records that were already there will be left with this attribute as null. Now, if we indicate in the transaction that that attribute does not accept nulls, what will happen? We see that when we reorganize, it launches a warning indicating that this attribute does not accept null values and does not have an initial value, so it'll assign the default value to the country ID attribute. A record will be created in the table where this attribute is the primary key, and in the table where we add it as a foreign key. It'll be assigned a value 0 if the attribute is of numeric type, empty if it's of character type, and false if it's of Boolean type. In this case, a new record will be created in the country table with country ID equals 0 and empty country name. And for all the records previously entered in the airport table, that value will be assigned to the new country ID attribute. If a country with ID equals 0 is registered, it'll be referenced. We will always have the option of going record by record and changing this value to the one we want. Or, we create a procedure that runs through all the airports with a for each and modifies country ID according to the conditions that we specify. We could also assign to the new country ID attribute an initial value that we know already exists in our database, as we'll see in a moment. Let's see the following case. Within the airport transaction, we want to add an attribute that records whether the airport entered is international or not. For this, we add the attribute airport international of Boolean type. Suppose we want the value to be true by default. To this end, we create a default rule. When we reorganize, we see again a warning, which tells us that the attribute we've just created does not accept null values. It has no initial value, so the empty value will be used as default. If we look at the records previously entered in the airport table, we see that in all of them, it assigned a false value to this new attribute, since it's the default value assigned to this type of data. If we want to enter a new record from the transaction, we can see that by default, it's set to true, as we assigned it in the rule, but it doesn't apply to the records that we already had. When this attribute is created, how can we have all previous records set to true? Through the initial value property. If instead of using the default rule, we set the initial value property of the attribute to true, it'll not only apply to new records, but all existing ones will take that value. This is one of the differences between using the default rule and using the initial value property. Another difference is that the default rule is specific to the transaction and not the attribute. As for the initial value property, it belongs to the attribute, and it'll apply anywhere it's used, including transactions, procedures, business components, and so on. Let's go back for a moment to the case where we added country ID to the airport table. Let's see what would happen if instead of doing it as we did, we had assigned an initial value. For example, suppose we know that all the airports already entered are from the country France. Since France has ID 2, we assign this value in the initial value of the country ID attribute. When running it, we can see that the airport table is reorganized and added to the country ID attribute. And when viewing the data, we see that in all the records previously entered, country ID took the value 2 corresponding to France. Even when we want to add a new record in airport, country ID will be initialized by default with the value 2, and we can modify it if we wish. And what would happen if we had put in the initial value of country ID a value that does not exist in the country table? So for example, 20. At runtime, we can see that in the previously entered records, the country ID attribute is assigned the value 20, even though we didn't have any country with this ID. What Genexus did in this case, in order to assign country ID the value 20, was to create a country in the country table with ID 20 and an empty name. Otherwise, there would be serious referential integrity conflicts. If at some point we no longer want this attribute to be initialized with a value, we can modify this property and remove the value we entered. This will no longer impact the records that we've entered. It's important to remember that the initial value is assigned to the new attribute when the table is reorganized. If we didn't assign an initial value to the attribute when it was added and the reorganization is executed, then it'll be necessary to run through all the records to assign a value to it. As we also mentioned, when creating a new record, if there's an initial value assigned, the new record will be created with the attribute at that value. Now suppose we want to record from the airport transaction the flights in each airport. So we enter a second level with the following attributes of the flight transaction. Since at the database level, the structure does not generate changes within the airport table, it does not impact previously entered records. A new airport flight table is generated, and it'll be empty. Now let's assume that in the flight transaction, we have an attribute that counts the number of seats entered for that flight. Also, from airport, we want to know the total number of seats, adding up all the flights that have been entered in that airport, so as to obtain a total capacity. For this, we've already created a formula attribute in the first level of the airport transaction with the sum formula, which will add the value of the flight capacity attribute of the flights entered for each airport. As we know, the attributes defined as a global formula are not stored in the database. Instead, their value is calculated every time it's needed, but this data is not persisted. Suppose you frequently need to access and work with this data. As it's calculated at runtime, if there are many records to be run through, for example, if there's a large number of flights entered, it can severely impact performance. To solve this situation, Genexus allows us to define a global formula attribute as redundant. This means that it'll no longer be a virtual attribute. Instead, it'll be stored in its associated table, and Genexus will keep the knowledge that the attribute is a formula and how to calculate its value. In this way, when executing the transaction that contains an attribute with a redundant formula, the formula will be evaluated and calculated, and the result will be stored in the database. Then, when we need to query or work with that attribute again, Genexus will retrieve the stored value from the database instead of spending time and effort to perform the calculation. To define this attribute as redundant, we right-click on the column headers row, select Column Chooser, and there we see all the columns that we can include in the transaction editor. We choose Redundant and drag it to the editor. By means of a checkbox, it gives us the option to mark the attribute as redundant. We select it and run it again. It'll ask us to reorganize the database, since, as we saw, the attribute we just marked as redundant will be added to it. When a new airport record is entered, the formula is triggered as usual in the transaction, adding up the total number of flights entered. And, when confirming this value, is also stored in the database. What will happen to the airport records that already existed in the database? In those records, what value will this attribute have in the table? When doing the reorganization and adding this attribute, Genexus runs through the previously entered records one by one, triggering the formula and saving its value in the table. When viewing the previous records, the new attribute appears with its corresponding value, which, as we said, is already stored in the database. So far, we've briefly seen how adding attributes affects a transaction with previous records, whether they're new attributes, inferred attributes, attributes with a redundant formula, or with a value in the initial value property. For more information, you can visit our wiki.